So by now, I'm sure you've all seen the video in the news that's going around social media about astronomer CEO Andy Bryan, who was caught with his head of HR, Kristen Cabot. And it seems to be the one thing that has been able to permeate through all this week's stories of ongoing travesties with the administration and MAGA, specifically in Washington and the United States, Israel, and other parts of the world. So, for those of you that don't know, astronomer CEO, they captured his image while he was holding the HR chief at a Coldplay concert, and that has galvanized the MAGA this week. Because if they hadn't jumped on this story about a man who's essentially having an extramarital affair and making jokes about it, then they'd have to talk about how Trump is continuing to fight to not have his name released in the Epstein files. They'd have to continue talking about how Trump has chronic venous insufficiency, which is essentially a precursor to deep vein thrombosis, thus saying that he might be in line for a blood clot that lodges itself in his lung and is potentially fatal. They'd have to sit there and continue to talk about how Donald Trump continues to challenge the 14th Amendment and is slowly being challenged by the courts, who are now putting the check back into the balance of his overreach. They'd have to talk about all these things that they don't want to talk about, because talking about those topics would have to entail them having a serious conversation, which they are fundamentally unable to have. So rather than to sit down and actually go into discussing all these things, and even whether or not last year's attempt on Donald Trump's life was actually a real thing and not some made up conspiracy hoax, they have to manufacture outrage to make sure that the base stays placated in some way. And so one of the things they've latched onto is, other than their hatred for Muslims and how Minnesota is apparently turning into Somalia, how this CEO got caught with his side piece. Now, we're not here to talk about the CEO and the side piece, because that's not necessarily something that should be talked about. This is a person who is having a relationship, and in today's world, relationships look and are defined any which way that people want to define them. They're not stuck to traditional norms of one woman, one man, and that's that. I have in my practice seen several people who have normalized their ability to be multiple relationships, polyamory type of relationships, where they would call them polycules and all these other types of euphemisms for their relationships, ultimately saying that they have multiple partners and that these partners are okay with it. We don't know if that's the situation here, but nevertheless, it's not really any of our business what consenting adults do in front or behind closed doors. For all we know, he could have had a conversation with his wife, and this could be part of some other arrangement they have. That's why America is great, because we do have the opportunity to not live within certain norms and express ourselves and how we love in all kinds of ways. That is why America exists as it does, so that we're able to have freedom. As long as we're not hurting people, that freedom seems to be what is most valued. There's a case to be made that he's hurting his wife or his partner. Again, that may be totally justified. Regardless, we don't know what arrangement they have, and we don't have the right to really speak about or comment or ridicule anything that's going on. But I bring that up because it's a perfect example of what is driving a lot of MAGA and this phenomenon that we live in today, because a lot of people don't really understand. When I say narcissism nation, how narcissism is baked into the cake, this is another example of that. Not what Andy Bryan is doing, but the hyper focus on this one incident, because this is a classic example of what we call the projective identification. And if we talk about projective identification, we're talking about object relations theory. And essentially what projective identification is and how we define it, it's a primitive defense to a narcissistic personality structure. Utilizing the words of Otto Kernberg, essentially it's a childlike response to offload our own guilt and shame. The way this looks classically is The common trope that if we suddenly had black people in power, they would enslave all the whites. That statement that's often repeated by white supremacists as a reason why you can't give African Americans or Mexicans or anybody else any type of real power exists because that's a projection of their own shame and their own guilt that they feel internally outwards towards the world. And so essentially what they're saying when they say that you can't put African Americans in charge because they would enslave all of us is their own guilt for being enslavers themselves and for being one of the original sins in this country. The first one obviously being the displacement and genocide of Native Americans. What that really is doing is telling on themselves that they do feel this shame and this guilt for the fact that they participated somehow, whether tacitly or generationally, have accumulated the wealth of and inherited the spoils of slavery. What that is essentially saying is, yes, this guilt and shame is so much inside of me that I have to project it onto somebody else, this time being the African Americans, and make it seem as if they would enslave us because that is exactly what we did. Another one would be when they say immigrants are lazy, and that's the big one going around these days, to justify ICE raids and to justify the violation of the 14th Amendment. What that is a projection of is white America often expressing their anger because of this internal guilt and shame they feel, because they know that they didn't build this country outside of inheriting the privilege of being white. They know that their true laziness exists in their inability to actually go out and find work. You see this in the very low job numbers in red states. You see this in the amounts of poverty that exists throughout red states like Tennessee, Alabama, Arkansas, Missouri, and these other types of environments where they have fallen into mass drug abuse as a means to not engage in any type of real upward mobility or social benefits. So what they're really saying is immigrants are lazy and freeloaders in this country because internally they see themselves every day on their food stamps and shopping at Walmart and really projecting that out, that they themselves are lazy and freeloaders in this country. And all we need to do is look at federal spending in the U.S. budget to realize that the top 10 states that are usually at the top of how much money they receive as opposed to how much they give out, usually are all red states. Mitch McConnell, the leader of the Republican Senate from Kentucky, his state led that list for a good 10 years straight back in the early 2010s. We're getting to the reality that people here are expressing themselves and expressing that shame internally. When we talk about projective identification, we're seeing it as a way for people to disown the internal conflicts and traits or feelings that they have and projecting them outwards onto people who are just trying to live their lives and are just trying to get ahead in the world. Essentially saying, I feel shame about this. You're the one that should be the shameful one. And it's a way to protect the self at all costs. It's one of these narcissistic defenses where accountability is dissolved and the world becomes a mirror, but the reflection is always warped. And so we see in social media platforms like TikTok, X, Instagram, they've incentivized performance-based projection because as rage bait, it becomes about moral superiority. It becomes us versus them, conservatives versus the libs, and you want to own the libs, right? Accusation replaces introspection. This person's a pedophile. That person's a rapist. This other person is a criminal. The victimhood itself is the currency that they live with because then they can always claim the moral superiority that they're the ones being attacked. They're the ones being replaced, rather than owning the fact that they're the ones actually perpetrating a lot of this hatred and evil that exists. Everyone's a preacher and no one's clean in this. Projective identification then becomes social media's operating system. Essentially, everyone on there is trying to project something out into the world. A lot of times when it becomes accusatory, that's when we see it as that projection of shame. And on today's Narcissism Nation, we're going to be talking about projective identification in the realm of MAGA and how it's become one of the baseline fundamental pieces of a self-governance regime that these people ultimately use to make themselves feel better about themselves. Most of MAGA, they recognize that they're not providing much value to this country other than the anger produced by their own internal shame. And thus, projective identification has now become the calling card of the MAGA bros. It's now the calling card of the fake, tough, masculine types that really aren't any of what they're saying, but rather are still just spoiled children in many ways who think like children and act like children, only in adult bodies. Thank you for joining me today on a Friday episode of Narcissism Nation, brought to you by Elevate.epo. I'm Enrique. Let's open it up. So let's talk about why MAGA seems to be obsessed with pedophilia and adultery. The CEO story is one that has really captivated MAGA because that's what they see in their leader, right? An adulterer. It's common knowledge because he's even bragged about it and written about it that he's cheated on his wives numerous times, paid for sex, and now potentially been implicated in fornication with minors. And we see then how this has become the calling card of the MAGA right, how everyone is either culturally bankrupt and spiritually bankrupt because they've had an affair like this CEO, or because they're pedophiles. And so we've seen, under the guise of wanting to protect children, how they've engaged in making movies about protecting people from pedophilia and wanting to be the champions and crusaders of the online safe spaces for catching predators and all of that. There's not to say that there's some value in that, because obviously you are getting some people off the street. But there is this very real sense that a lot of people are living with this idea that pedophilia lives top of mind. Adulterers are bad because they're bad Christians, right? That drag queens are grooming people to become gay, and that the liberal elites are the ones who are trying to have this indoctrination of people to turn them into anti-American evildoers who are just some of the worst people that you could imagine. But a lot of that is them channeling their own anger. The reason that they are so upset about groomers and molesters and pedophiles is probably because their cousin had molested them when they were young, at 14 years old. They were touched inappropriately in some way by a family member. And that's a very real thing, because if we look at the numbers from the National Center for Victims of Crime, you get a very stark number here, right? U.S. Department of Health in 2010, so this was 15 years ago, and you can only imagine that the numbers have gone up, right? They had it around 9.2 to 10% kids who were sexually assaulted. Studies by Crimes Against Children Research Center show that 1 in 5 girls and 1 in 20 boys is the victim of child sexual abuse. Again, this was 2010. Self-reports studies show 20% of adult females and between 5 to 10% of adult males recall a childhood assault or abuse incident. During a 1-year period in the U.S., about 16% of youth aged 14 to 17 had been sexually victimized. Over the course of their lifetime, 28% of U.S. youths ages 14 to 17 have been sexually victimized, most generally between the ages of 7 to 13. A study by the Department of Health and Human Services in 2022 indicated that the states with the highest amounts of child abuse, right? Top 10, we're looking at West Virginia, Iowa, Maine, Alaska, Oklahoma, Mississippi, South Carolina, Arkansas, New Mexico. So you take a look at that list and you're seeing a lot of red states, some blue states, but majority of them coming from very deep entrenched red states. If we look at that same study, the number of child fatalities from abuse and neglect gets a little bit more clear. Missouri, South Dakota, Arkansas, Maryland, Georgia, Alaska, Ohio, New Mexico, North Carolina. That tells you a pretty big story then, that the majority of child abuse and child fatalities are coming from deep entrenched red states. Thus, you correlate that in the business, you see that these sample sizes essentially do tell you a pretty good inferential data point. What that tells you is that red states seem to abuse kids a lot more than blue states. And thus, it would stand to reason that red state voters, which in many cases here are now MAGA, would be projecting a lot of child abuse fantasy because they themselves were either victims of that child abuse and are carrying that shame and guilt, or perpetrators of that abuse and are carrying that shame and guilt. And that's why we get a lot of MAGA who come out and project that liberals are child abusers and child rapists, when in reality, these are the people that are actually doing these crimes. This is why they're obsessed with it, because of that internal guilt that they feel so much. They're trying to put that on someone else and make that person react in a way that gets them riled up and creates the enactment they need to start filling the social media void with all this anger and rage bait and stuff that sort of gets people going, because this is what the name of the game is, right? Interactions in social media, rage baiting to the point where you get that person to react. Now you can feel justified in this projective identification. What they've essentially done is put all this shame into someone else. When they respond, like in most narcissistic relationships, that response becomes pathologized, and then that's a justification that these narcissists use to give you the sociopathic response. You set up settlements in the West. You disturb people who had been there for centuries before you even arrived. When those people get upset because you encroach on their space and fight back, you pathologize them and use that as justification to wipe them out, commit genocide and atrocities. When you're Israel and you come to a country that wasn't yours and you encroach and keep taking more and more, and when the people who were there before you start to respond negatively because they're saying, hey, what the hell, I've been here my whole life and now you're asking me at gunpoint to move. When they respond and they want to have some type of a freedom fighting coalition, it gets labeled a terrorist organization, and that justifies bombing them and killing them and seeing exactly what they're doing in Gaza right now. The IDF is not unlike the United States early pilgrim settlers, is not unlike the narcissist in your life. They are people who come in, they project their shame onto you, and when you respond in a way like building boundaries, they get upset and then they pathologize your boundary as the justification to keep attacking you and keeping you locked in this cycle of abuse. This is what classic projective identification is. And the reason they're so hung up on Andy Byron is because if we take a look at the numbers, the top 10 states with the most divorces: Arkansas, Wyoming, Kentucky, West Virginia, Oklahoma, Idaho, Alabama, Delaware, Tennessee, New Mexico. Again, we're seeing the same pattern here. Red states commit the most child abuse. Red states commit the most child deaths by abuse. Red states seeking out the highest divorce rates. We're seeing a pattern of red states projecting all the shame and guilt because these are people who participated in their own adultery, which led to a divorce, were the victims of an adultery episode, which then led to divorce. And we have to remember that 70% of divorces are brought by a woman. 7 times out of 10, most divorces are brought by a woman. That means there's a lot of female rejection of men. And that is emasculation. When a woman rejects a man at that scale, they're essentially saying they have rejected the notion that this person was ever a real man, a provider, or someone who was a safe space for them. They're saying these states have a population full of men who aren't really men. And so we have the classic example of the red state MAGA voter screaming into the void that exists oftentimes in these spaces, their own shame and guilt and all the worst parts of themselves, trying to offload that onto people who are just trying to go about their business and enjoy social media for the doom scrolling activity that it is. It's all part of the same thing, right? It's the girl they hit in 2012, the cousin they molested at 14, the 19-year-old that they groomed at church, the escort habit that they have and they're sort of funding with all their crypto losses. Trump then becomes the proxy scapegoat savior because he's the perfect mirror, the perfect foil for this total lack of American value that exists in the American red state South. Because what they're saying is if Trump can be forgiven and his image can be laundered and he can become the president of the United States, then so can I. We are a nation of sick individuals that are willing to excuse a criminal who was found guilty in the Southern District of New York just last year. We're willing to excuse someone that in his book proudly proclaimed about his proclivity of walking in on underage models at the Miss America and Miss Universe pageants. He is someone who has proudly proclaimed that he has had intercourse with young women on the Lolita Express, that he was one of Epstein's best friends. And they're saying that because the media keeps falling for this con man and his earned media grift that he's protected throughout the years. Because again, if the media is after him, then they're the hero of their own sort of sick and twisted narrative and story as well. They're not defending Donald Trump. They're defending the idea that the past doesn't count for much. If the rage is loud enough and they can get enough people to buy into that collective sense of shame that they themselves have, which, as we've seen through the numbers, exists a lot throughout the South and is a predominant calling card of these red states. So I want to introduce the concept of a person that I've come across while in my practice. We'll call him Jay, right? The MAGA everyman that exists out in the world. He's a perfect composite for what MAGA is and how they represent themselves. This is the man every failed boy becomes when he has no skills, no spine, and a TikTok account. He doesn't post truth. He posts alibis. His internal structure is projective identification welded to street-level narcissism. Deep shame from absentee father, sexual trauma, potentially a violent past, uses rage politics to cover a life of criminality and cowardice. There's no real job history here. Sometimes he sold some weed. Maybe he scammed the EDD during COVID. He's been able to do some day trading with sort of his dad's money, and maybe he came into a couple of good runs. Maybe he's a gambling addict and had some big wins, put that in crypto. Now he's pushing the big crypto narrative that he's one of these crypto bros. His dad died, left him about 17 grand. Right? He put that into some crypto scam. He blew it on sneakers and ring lights. Now he preaches sovereignty, but lives at mom's house using her Wi-Fi. He's got tattoos on his neck. He wears a dumb red hat. Drives a big truck because that's what people do when they have their first payday. They get the biggest truck to account for the fact that they're lacking in certain masculine components. And the content style screams about child trafficking, but has a sealed record from 2007 themselves. They've all got these criminal records that they've been able to either have sealed or expunged somehow, but they've found their way throughout the legal industry dynamics and have only been saved by the fact that they've been white enough to not be in trouble. He wears a cross, tags Jesus in captions, has 3 domestic battery charges to his name, calls women, quote, queens, but has 2 kids who doesn't claim. Essentially one of these like baby daddy types who probably behind on his child support as well. His core motivation then becomes, I need to be seen as a savior so no one sees the bodies I've buried, right? No one sees all the things that he carries in his life, which are full of shame. His inability to raise his kids, his inability to find sort of solid work and be an upstanding citizen and model for his children. But rather he's a womanizing, if not closeted homosexual who is stuck in this shame spiral because he keeps turning to Jesus and every time. And so fundamentally, these type of men are un-American at their core because they preach family values, yet they were brought up in some foster home and were in and out of all kinds of youth facilities, had major issues with their own sort of anger and inability to express themselves, and they've never actually had a stable place to set up roots. Yet they're the champions of the American family, and they're the ones who are preaching what American family should look like. Right? They wrap themselves in the flag and they scream about the freedom, but they're the least American force in public life. They've never voted except for a man who saw them as the outcast derelicts that they are. They reject work, they reject accountability, they reject the community that they live in. They replace the American dream with clout fraud. It's the identity grift of them trying to pass themselves off as this sort of version of masculinity, which they clearly are not. And that they live in this internal victimhood, justifying their hatred towards people who don't have the same skin color as them. are the crypto criminals turned culture warriors, laundering trauma through self-righteousness and religious cosplay. And we see a guy like Terrence K. Williams, for example, right? He is not a political commentator. He's a failed comedian, not even a real one. He's just a guy that found Facebook fame one day. And that sort of led to us having to tolerate this person who obviously doesn't have an education and is the last person to be speaking on what actual family values or American values are. Because if you look at his upbringing, he's possibly one of the most broken and fragmented individuals that you'll ever find. Yet he's a walking mugshot with a ring light, essentially, when you look at him and everything he has to offer. This is not free speech. It's delusional speech funded by undisclosed felonies, is what this person ultimately is, right? And yet he has a following because he identifies and appeals to the same type of people who are outcasts from the systems, don't have any real basis in what actual family values are or American values are, and want to keep defining the world through their warped sense of their own upbringing. And so when we get to their core and we're looking at whether it's Jay, whether it's Kay Williams, whether it's one of these other people on TikTok with the tattoos and the hats and the silly memes and nonsense that they post, it's not about hatred for pedophiles when they start talking about this. Jim Caviezel, it's not about his hatred for pedophiles. It's the mirror that he hates, the thing that he sees when he has to look at himself internally, all these people internally, and they see that part of themselves. That's what they hate. And that's what they're projecting. Every time they post about Biden's sins, they're begging to be forgiven for their own sins. That's how we should interpret that. Social media is the courtroom, the algorithm, his jury, and the comments section are his therapists. This is how he is able to sleep at night, knowing that he's probably the one committing depraved acts and is getting other people to respond positively towards the way that he is presenting himself. They don't want freedom at the end of the day. That's not about freedom. And January 6th showed us, and all the oath keepers trying to arrest people illegally, showing you that they want immunity for their own bad actions. They want to feel good about the fact that they're able to be the worst versions of Americans, live with that shame, but have it expunged and offloaded to someone else. And so when you have no real resume and no real work ethic and a sealed record, patriotism becomes the last hustle that you ultimately have. When MAGA goes away, these people will never be heard of again because they don't have any real redeeming factors other than the fact that they were able to attach themselves to a movement that celebrated their own dysfunction. When you look at MAGA, you should look at a pool of people who are ultimately pedophiles themselves, that are probably some of the worst versions of American people because they have a lot of blood on their hands. They're not the ones who are the church-going, upstanding citizens they think they are. And I know a lot of them. I have them in my own family, and I can tell you firsthand, these people are not anything that they appear to even remotely present themselves as. So when looking at projective identification, we're seeing a common theme, right? People who are engaged in some of the worst versions of humanity are often the ones screaming the loudest and have the bigger platform. That should give you a red flag to the fact that these people have probably done a lot of what they're talking about in the past, if not been victims of it. There is a real big issue here with people abusing children and abusing women, attacking the people who society has seen as the most vulnerable. It's not a reason to put all of that shame on other folk who are just trying to make a living and trying to get by. That is not a reason to paint people who don't see their side of politics as ungodly. While there are parts of the population that do engage in things that are questionable, and the polycule example that I brought up, I'm not saying I agree with that either, but I respect the right for those people to have that type of lifestyle. My job isn't to judge them. My job is to help them navigate their own internal conflicts so that they can lead a healthier life. But that's the part where my projection of any of that ends, because I don't ultimately go out and start projecting out about any type of hatred towards any one particular people. I am pointing out the fact that there's hatred that exists as a product of their own internalized shame. And that is really what Melanie Klein was talking about in object relations theory. That is really what Nancy McWilliams talks about. Projective identification is used as a primitive defense. for narcissism. When we say primitive defense for narcissism, I know there's a lot of people in the comments who keep telling me, stop using all these fancy big words. What I mean is people who act like children because they still think like children. The reason they act that way is because it's easier for them to put all that on someone else and ridicule that person rather than sit and process everything that lives inside of them. All the ugly experience, brokenness of a world and a life that has not been very meaningful, not very well lived, has been exploitative of other folks and potentially abusive of others. That is what I'm talking about. Projective identification with Narcissism Nation is built into the cake to supporting Donald Trump, is built into the cake to supporting the IDF, and is built into the cake to a lot of these online grifters who have made it their career just calling out these atrocities that ultimately live in their own hearts. You don't have to be that way, though, because Precision Cycle is here to help you navigate your own guilt and shame and process it and put it in a compartment within yourself that allows you to be the best version of yourself. So you don't have to make a fool of yourself spouting out nonsense on social media and trying to rile up the base to attack people who are just trying to live lives themselves. But really, the basis for MAGA and projective identification, which is the basis for narcissism. And this is a classic example of why this week, rather than talking about why President Trump continues to not want the Epstein file disclosed, or why Texas continues to flounder in its ability to help its people after the flood, and even as we try to talk about why parts of California, Altadena, and Pacific Palisades continue to be unbuilt, this is because all of these people, whether it's Newsom, whether it's Trump, whether it's anybody else, live with the collective shame of the fact that they have not really done anything. They're wasting time. They're more stuck on furthering their own narcissistic endeavors. Karen Bass, another person. And they are now gaslighting and projecting all this stuff towards everyone else. That is what all this is. We should look at the fact that projective identification isn't just a clinical term. It's the core architecture of America's descent. And these men with their filters, fake flags, fragile egos are not the resistance that they claim they are. They are the actual confession for all the evil that exists in this country. Thank you very much. My name is Enrique Artiaga. If anything has appealed to you, I'd welcome you to send me an email, enrique@elevateepo.com. You can also reach me at Precision Cycle TV on Instagram, Threads, and TikTok. Narcissism Nation on YouTube. Thank you very much. This has been a different type of week, but we'll be back next week with 3 new episodes of Narcissism Nation, Precision Cycle BTS. Once again, we are in our July recalibration call. If you want to join us, you can receive up to $100 back for every referral that you send over to Precision Cycle. You can receive that $100 discount yourself if you decide to come on, have a Precision Cycle, and experience the Precision Cycle difference when you are able to receive our 7-point dimensional personality assessment, which is tracking your emotional tables and quotients in real time for every week, week by week. We invite you to understand why Precision Cycle is better than therapy, because we get results that are measurable and that are actually guaranteed. Once again, my name is Enrique. Thank you very much for joining me. Have a great week and enjoy your summer. Take care.